Welcome to the Bible Made Clear. We're going to take a quick walk through the minor prophet Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, however you want to pronounce his name. And Habakkuk, his name means to embrace. And this would be as one embraces a weeping child to comfort him. So that's the idea behind his name. And you'll see that play out in the book. So this message was addressed to Judah. The southern kingdom, the northern kingdom at this point, had been led away by the Assyrians. And at this point, I think it'll be clear that we're moving towards the end of Judah's time before Babylon takes them into captivity in 586. So again, Habakkuk was a contemporary of Jeremiah, and he prophesied really at the end of Josiah's reign. Remember, Josiah was the last good king out of the 20 southern kings, and this is really on the brink of Judah's destruction by Babylon. So there's a couple of issues that we need to walk through in this short little book. The first one is the perplexities of Habakkuk. Now, faith is tested and taught basically in the first couple of chapters. And the first problem that he faces is, why does God allow wicked practices to continue in Judah? Now, Habakkuk was actually seeing these wicked practices continue, and he was pleading for understanding as to why God was allowing them, something that I think is only a problem for people of faith, because obviously God has the capability of removing any kind of problem. But the problem is that when we challenge God and say, why do you allow wicked things to happen? If God were to stop all wickedness, first of all, he could start with us, because we're all sinners. The second problem is that we're assuming that we know more than what God knows. Third, God would have to remove people's freedom. It means that he would have to eliminate the ability that he's given man for his free choices, and to take them away. So every time an evil action or an evil plan was going to be worked, or just some kind of calamity, that he would just stop it all. Now, eventually, this is going to happen. But right now, God allows a measure of freedom so that people can make a decision whether they're going to love him or hate him. And he gives them that choice. So let's take a quick look at chapter 1. And notice in verse 2, he says, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? Even cry out to you violence. In other words, that's what was happening. And you will not save. Why do you show me iniquity and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore, the law is powerless. In other words, that was how it appeared to be from Habakkuk's standpoint, because people were disobeying it. And justice never goes forth, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, perverse judgment proceeds. So this was the struggle of Habakkuk, and this is why the first problem he had was, like, why do you allow me to see this? And then this is really the verses that we just quoted, and in the first couple of verses, verse 2 and 3, and then God seems to be silent in evil times, as I said, because he does allow a measure of wickedness to work itself out. Otherwise, he would just eliminate probably everybody in order to eliminate all wickedness. You really can't have it both ways. Oftentimes skeptics challenge, why would God allow wickedness to continue? But then when God does step forward and bring judgment, then they accuse him of acting unjustly. So you really can't have it both ways. What people oftentimes, and this is not Habakkuk. Habakkuk is a faithful prophet. But when skeptics challenge, they just want things to be the way they want them. Habakkuk's problem is he knew that God was powerful enough and loving enough to remove all the wickedness, but it was continuing. So the first answer to Habakkuk comes in verse 5 through 11. And verse 5 and the beginning of 6 says, I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are the Babylonians. And this is something that Habakkuk would never have dreamed. And it goes on to say that, if I told it to you, your ears would be tingling. So here's the dilemma. The Babylonians on the meter were worse than Judah. So Judah was doing bad. They were definitely into idolatry at this point. But the problem is the Babylonians were much worse. Why would you use somebody that was more evil as a nation to judge your own people? This was the dilemma of the book. So the second issue that was brought up is, why will God use, now that Habakkuk knows that, wicked people to punish Judah? Verse 12 and 13 in chapter 1. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? Art thou of purer eyes than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity? Therefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously. So the question is, Lord, you're holy. How could you use these people? You can't even look on iniquity because of your holiness. And, why would God use more wicked people to judge his own? That's a difficulty. And so here comes the second answer, or the answer to the second problem. And the answer is to have faith in God's word. He tells them in chapter 2, write the vision, make it plain upon tables. In other words, you write down what I'm telling you, that he may run that readeth it. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. This is a huge verse, and it is quoted by Paul in the New Testament. If you believe he wrote Hebrews anyways, 3 times. And so the answer is that God's word's to be trusted, and God's to be trusted because of what he says in his word. So this verse is quoted in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews, and we'll take a look at that. So the 3 times, first time it's quoted in Romans, Paul says the just shall live by faith. And the emphasis in Romans is on the just, or justification. And then when he quotes it in Galatians, shall live is really the emphasis of the verse. And we're dealing with sanctification there. That's how believers shall live, right? And then in Hebrews, the emphasis is on faith. The verse is the just shall live by faith. And in each of these books, there's an emphasis on one aspect of the sentence. Now, the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. That's from Hebrews 10:38. So, the extension of the second answer is in chapter 2, and this is God's plan. So after God says, look, you need to trust my word, you need to have faith in what I'm telling you, now this is what's going to occur. God will judge Babylon for their wickedness. They're not getting away with anything. He's only using them as an instrument of judgment. And then 5 woes are pronounced against Babylon. And this is obviously a lesson to any nation, because these are the things that God will come against and eventually make right. Woe to him who increases what is not his, in chapter 2, verse 6. That's the first woe out of the 5. So the first woe is for heaping up property that is not his, the same oppression that Judah practiced. So we saw in the book of Micah that when the wicked leaders went to bed, they couldn't even get any sleep unless they would be able to figure out some way to rip everybody off and use their power to just oppress people and take things from them, especially their land and inheritance. The second woe is to him who covets evil gain for his house. In other words, coveting is something that, you just wanting more and more, something that is beyond really what you need. Now, that doesn't mean that if I need a jacket that I can't go get a good one or something like that. I mean, in other words, I can buy what I need. Coveting is when I have what I need, whether it's really expensive or not expensive isn't the issue, but then I just keep wanting more and more and more and more and more. And these people were getting it by evil means. So it's basically greediness and self-exaltation. So they were exalting themselves as they accumulated through their greed. The third woe to him who builds a town with bloodshed, who establishes a city by iniquity. So this is in verse 12, and it deals with the tyrannical oppression to captive people, as Babylon would take over different nations, like it was going to do with Judah. They would severely oppress them. They would kill a lot of people, and then they would take people captive. So they would always go beyond what God desired them to do. The next woe, in verse 15, woe to him who gives drink to his neighbor, pressing him to your bottle, even to make him drunk, that you may look on his nakedness. So this is treatment of weaker nations and people. Treatment of weaker nations and people was immoral and shameful. They took advantage of those they purposely intoxicated. So anytime an individual or a nation takes advantage of somebody else, especially by intoxicating them or drugging them or doing something like that, there's nothing more wicked than that. Think about it. We've seen people go to court for that, for doing things to people after they drug them. This is an oppression, and this is a wickedness that is entirely unacceptable from an individual or from a nation. Though people think that nobody is watching, God is always watching. He sees what everybody is doing. The next woe to him who says to wood, awake, to silent stone, arise. It shall teach, behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, yet in it there is no breath at all. It's about idolatry. So the greatest sin of all is idolatry, because you're replacing God with a false god. And Babylon was the center of idolatry with the multiple gods they worshipped. They had a pantheon of gods like the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians. So they were very much an idolatrous nation, a pagan nation. So here's the outline of the book, continued in chapter 3, now that Habakkuk had stepped forth in faith to trust God, and God revealed his plan of judgment against the Babylonians, Habakkuk praises God because faith is always triumphant. Now, first of all, this is arranged in more of a song, which is why you have these pauses. Selah means to pause and consider. So we see this through the Psalms, this word Selah. And the first praise is for God's person, the first 3 verses. It's a prayer to revive or to keep alive God's work. Then there's praise for God's power. And then there's a pause to consider that in verses 4 to 9. His ways are everlasting. It's in verse 6. The next is praise for God's purpose, verses 10 to 13. And verses 12 and 13 say, you march across the earth with indignation, you trample down the nations in wrath, you come out to save your people. See, ultimately, this is where God is moving towards. And then faith brought praise to God at the end for Habakkuk. It says in verse 17 to 19, though the fig tree does not bud, in other words, there's no evidence, and there is no fruit on the vines, though the olive tree fails, and the fields produce no food, though there is no sheep in the pen, no cattle in the stalls, yet I will triumph in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yahweh my Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like those of a deer, and enables me to walk on mountain heights, for the choir director on stringed instruments. So there you see the last verse tells you that he's singing a song, but what he's doing is he's saying, look, I may not see the results of what God is saying yet, but because he has said it, I'm going to believe it, and I'm going to live as though his word is not only is true, but will continue to come true. So Habakkuk's response to God was that he would live in light of the truth of God's word, verse 2-4, right? The just shall live by faith, and rejoice in it no matter what he currently sees in his nation. So in summary, I guess we could encapsulate this book into Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So faith takes the place of the substantiation, essentially, of what is promised to be done. Because it hasn't happened yet, you don't have the substance of the fulfillment. But faith takes the place of that because you know God is true to his word, of the things hoped for. Hoped is really not like in English, I hope, but it means the things expected. Hope in the Bible, the word is used as a sure expectation, not something that, you know, like my friend, he said he'll be by at 5. I hope he actually arrives. No, it's something that's certain and expected. That's how the word is used. So faith is really the substance, as far as the person that has it, of the things that they expect. And it becomes the evidence. Their faith in what God has said becomes the evidence of what they don't see. Then I want to end with this quote by Blaise Pascal. He said, in faith there is enough light for those who want to believe and enough shadows to blind those who don't. And that's really, when it comes to faith in God and the evidence that God provides for the reasons for our faith and trust in him, there is always enough light if we want to believe and take him at his word, and also by the evidence that we see in general revelation, which is creation, and in special revelation, which is his word. There's always enough light there. and there's enough shadows to blind those who have no interest. So that's the book of Habakkuk. Hopefully that was simple and clear enough, and may God continue to bless you as you continue to study His Word.